settled and the night finally surrendered to a blood-red dawn. The frame of the cottage, little more than a crooked timber shack wedged between two sloping, briar-choked hills, was charred, half-collapsed, and groaning under its own ruin. But the door should have been ash. Instead, it hung there like a survivor of a forgotten world, singed but intact, shimmering faintly in the weak morning light. And carved into that stubborn slab of wood, neat as scripture on a church lectern, were 40 marks, pressed in so deep they had become part of the grain. Not crosses, not initials. They were tally marks. 40 strokes, 40 men, 40 Klansmen. But the artifact that silenced even the rowdiest of the deputies wasn't the marked door. It was the thing they found buried beneath the hearthstone, under the old woman's bed of cinders. Sheriff Abner Cotter lifted it with gloved hands, though he later admitted he could feel its chill through the leather, an iron buckle strap reinforced with a strip of Confederate gray, the sort used to fasten cavalry scabbards during the darkest years of the war. Except this one had names scratched into its underside, names of officers from the 16th Alabama, and beside each name, a date, nearly 200 of them, and every date fell between 1863 and 1865, in a radius no wider than 15 miles from this very hill. Cotter's voice trembled as he dictated the final line of his discovery report, a line he would try his best to retract for the rest of his short, uneasy life. God help us. The last entry bears yesterday's date. The house had belonged to a reclusive woman the county knew only as Miss Aurelia. People said she barely spoke, that she could pass through town like a shadow, that she had a way of making grown men straighten their posture without ever raising her eyes. Some whispered she was touched by spirits. Others claimed she was just a tortured widow of the war years, a hermit clinging to the only land she'd ever called hers. But the carved door, the strap of Confederate dead, and the 40 vanished men from the night before, their horses found running loose at the tree line, told a different story. A story no one in that county dared to speak aloud, not even in prayer. Because if the truth was real, it meant the war hadn't ended for everyone. Some battles still flickered in the dark corners of the South, waiting to be rediscovered. And if the old stories were true, if the calculations on that iron strap were accurate, then Miss Aurelia had ended more lives in secret than the entire company of men who'd ridden out to intimidate her. Before we continue with the story of Aurelia Bellfield and the night 40 Klansmen cornered her house, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The year was 1892, nearly 3 decades after the guns had gone quiet at Appomattox, but the rural spine of northern Alabama remained haunted by a tension that pulsed like sickness beneath the soil. Reconstruction had officially ended 15 years prior, and the promises once etched onto parchment in Washington had long since blown away like dust deposits across the red clay. Freedmen struggled to claim their scraps of land. White planters struggled to reclaim their dominance, and politicians, always ready to stir a dying fire, fed resentment into every voting hall and courthouse. The town of Marrow Creek was barely a town at all, just a loosely stitched settlement of wooden storefronts threading the single-wagon road like beads on a fraying cord. A weather-beaten church sat at one end, its bell tower leaning as though exhausted from decades of forced sermons calling for obedience and repentance in equal measure. On the other end stood the general store, where the scent of tobacco leaves and molasses clung thick to the air, mixing with the sharp tang of iron nails and kerosene lamps. In between lay all the usual fixtures of rural life, the smithy ringing from dawn to dusk, children in muddy boots kicking up clouds of dust, and horses nickering behind the hitch rails like restless phantoms. But if one wandered a mile beyond town, past the last fence posts and the thickets where blackberry vines strangled old tree stumps, the air changed. It grew quieter, not peaceful but watchful, as though the land itself remembered too much. Farmers avoided those woods at dusk. Hunters swore they heard footsteps that weren't their own. And for nearly 30 years, locals had whispered a single warning when children strayed too close. Stay clear of Bellfield Hollow. The hollow wasn't on any official map, but everyone knew its path. A gnarled oak tree marked the entryway, its branches bent under their own weight like an old woman hunched in perpetual grief. Past it, a narrow trail descended into a basin where the earth felt older than the rest of Alabama, dense with dark soil and heavy with the smell of wet leaves. Mist clung stubbornly here even in summer, and in winter the cold settled into bones with a permanence no fire could chase away. And it was deep in this basin, nearly swallowed by the woods, that Aurelia Bellfield made her home. Few knew when she had arrived. Fewer still knew where she had come from. Some of the oldest residents claimed she'd wandered in shortly after the war's end, a thin, barefoot woman who walked as though she had traveled continents without ever stopping to sleep. Others said she had been born in bondage on a plantation north of the river, that she had fled after witnessing atrocities beyond the imagination of civilized folk. Old Reverend Granger once confessed after a sermon that Aurelia carried the look of someone who had seen the devil's handwriting and lived long enough to translate it. But whatever truth may have existed beneath these tales, no one bothered Aurelia. She wrote no letters, sought no help, and asked for no company. She tended her small cottage, raised a harsh little garden scraped from the stubborn soil, and made rare treks into town to purchase salt or flour. Her posture was straight, her stride deliberate. When she spoke, her voice was low but firm, shaped by rhythms that suggested both education and hardship. Even the most mean-spirited gossip avoided her path. Something in her presence reminded people of the quiet before a storm. Yet the land around Marrow Creek did not belong only to farmers and wanderers. The end of Reconstruction had allowed certain men who believed the Confederacy's defeat was a humiliation that must be corrected, to gather again in shadow. They rode at night draped in white cloth and bitterness, proclaiming themselves guardians of the old order. In church pews they called themselves gentlemen. In the woods they called themselves the Brotherhood. But the rest of Alabama knew them by their true name. The Ku Klux Klan had returned. Their rituals were predictable in intent but erratic in outcome. Intimidation rides, cross burnings, threats carved into barn doors, beatings administered under the excuse of moral correction. They had grown bolder in recent months, fueled by new leadership and the false promise that the county must be restored to Southern dignity. But in Marrow Creek, their bravado had faltered when conversation turned toward Aurelia Bellfield. Their meetings grew quieter whenever her name slipped into the lantern-lit circle. Some claimed she carried a gun with unnatural accuracy. Others insisted she had a protector, perhaps a veteran soldier hiding somewhere in the woods. One particularly superstitious member swore he saw her walking the hollow at midnight without a lantern, moving with a stillness no living creature could mimic. But men in groups are easily persuaded of their own invincibility. And the Klan, swollen with new recruits and whiskey-stained courage, soon convinced themselves that Aurelia Bellfield had become a symbol of defiance, a stain that needed erasing. But this confidence, this belief that she was merely a lone, vulnerable black woman living in the woods, was born from ignorance, because while the men of Marrow Creek remembered the war as a wound, Aurelia remembered it as a battlefield she had shaped with her own hands. In the early 1860s, Alabama had been a cauldron of desperation and rage. Confederate encampments dotted the hills, their campfires burning long into the night while exhausted soldiers limped through mud and fever. The cries of wounded men drifted across fields thick with the stench of gunpowder. Horse hooves churned up the earth, mixing spilled blood with the sticky clay. It was in these conditions, where death lingered in the air like an unwelcome sermon, that Aurelia had earned her reputation, though no official ledger ever recorded her name. Freedmen who found refuge in Union lines carried whispered stories of a woman who moved through the wilderness like an apparition, striking small Confederate patrols with shocking efficiency. They described her as unflinching, calculating, and impossible to catch. Rumors spread of a runaway who became a one-woman sabotage unit, decimating cavalry scouts, poisoning supply caches, and guiding groups of escaping men to safety through a network of abandoned mines and toppled rail lines. Confederate soldiers spoke of her too, always in hushed tones, calling her the Gray Reaper, for she wore a coat taken from a fallen cavalry officer to blend in at dusk. Commanders dismissed these tales as battlefield folklore, convenient explanations for their failures. But the iron strap found beneath Aurelia's hearthstone told a very different story, one etched in handwriting that was careful, steady, and undeniably real. A record of nearly 200 soldiers who had vanished without proper explanation, each marked with a date and a county border that never changed. The truth, it seemed, was that Aurelia Bellfield had not been a rumor at all. She had been a force. And now, decades later, the ghosts of that war had returned to her doorstep, wearing white robes instead of gray uniforms. The sun had barely set the night they arrived, 40 of them riding with torches that cast trembling halos of orange across the trees. Their leader, Ephraim Dulles, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his need for admiration, addressed the group before they descended into Bellfield Hollow. "She ain't nothing but an old witch," he rasped, adjusting the pistol tucked into his belt. "We make an example of her tonight, show the county no one's above correction." A younger rider asked quietly, "And what if the tales are true? What if she ain't alone out there?" Dulles turned his hooded face sharply. "You scared of shadows, boy?" "No, sir," the young man breathed, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. They believed they were the hunters. They had no reason at all, to suspect that Aurelia Bellfield had been waiting. They did not know she kept a lantern burning inside her cabin only on nights when visitors were expected. They did not know she had watched the clan grow more brazen, had listened from the woods as their voices carried on the wind. They did not know she had been preparing for them long before they rode out. But the door, the marked door, the one that refused to burn, had known. And before the night was over, every one of those men would learn the truth inscribed on that stubborn wood. If the hollow had a center, a quiet pulse around which all its shadows revolved, it was Aurelia Bellfield herself. A woman both ordinary and impossible, shaped by years that carved her into something the county neither understood nor wished to acknowledge. She was small in stature, barely 5 feet, her frame wiry rather than fragile. Age had etched faint lines around her mouth and eyes, though they seemed less like the marks of time and more like the residue of memory. Her skin carried the deep, earthy tone of someone who had worked under sun and hardship alike. Strands of silver threaded through her tightly coiled hair, which she kept pinned in a simple knot at the base of her skull. Anyone observing her from a distance might have mistaken her for a quiet grandmother tending a modest life in solitude. But her eyes, those were different. They were dark and steady, the kind that made people speak more softly without knowing why. When she looked at someone, she did not stare. She assessed, as though measuring the weight of their soul and the burden of their intentions. She said little in town, but when she did, her voice carried a quiet clarity. Once, when the general store proprietor tried to short her on a sack of sugar, Aurelia had simply placed the bag back on the counter and said, "Sir, I'll pay fair coin for fair measure, no more and no less." Her tone wasn't confrontational. It was final. The proprietor blinked, cleared his throat, and weighed the sugar properly. When she left, he muttered, "Ain't right for a woman to look a man in the eye like that." But even then, he watched her go with a hint of unease. Aurelia was not hostile, but she carried herself like someone accustomed to danger. someone who knew the geography of fear but chose not to be shaped by it. Those who passed her in town often felt the air shift around her, as if the world recognized her presence and stepped aside to make room. Yet, Aurelia did not consider herself extraordinary. She lived simply, tended her land, and fed the stray black hound that sometimes slunk around her door. She preserved peaches in jars lined neatly on her shelves. She stitched and restitched an old quilt that had survived more winters than most homes in Marrow Creek. She prayed, though seldom aloud, and always with a steady rhythm of someone who had bargained with heaven in darker times. Her solitude had become a legend of its own, but legends do not form without contrast. And Aurelia's story, like any story involving violence, fear, and the hunger of men, was bound tightly to another figure. Ephraim Dulles, the de facto leader of Marrow Creek's clan chapter, was a man who had learned young that cruelty granted him respect among those too weak or too angry to think for themselves. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face shaped by harsh angles and a beard that grew in uneven patches across his jaw. His hair, once a proud Confederate blonde, had darkened with age and poor temper. Those who met him described the smell of whiskey on his breath and the faint trace of cigar smoke that clung to his coat, though he prided himself on his discipline and southern refinement. In truth, Ephraim possessed neither, but what he lacked in grace, he compensated for in presence. When he entered a room, conversations fell into nervous silence, as though his arrival signaled a shift in the atmosphere that everyone could feel in their bones. His father, Captain Silas Dulles, had been a Confederate officer who perished in some unremarkable skirmish late in the war. Ephraim carried the memory like a badge he'd never earned but flaunted nonetheless. He often said, "My daddy died defending Alabama's honor. It's my duty to carry that torch." But honor was never Ephraim's true motive. Power was, and fear made power easy to claim. One evening, not long before the night at the Hollow, Ephraim had stood outside the livery stable, boasting to a handful of eager recruits. His voice carried through the humid dusk. "You know what's wrong with this county? We let folks forget their place. Northern fools think they can rewrite what God decided long before any of us were born." A young man, tall, thin, barely old enough to shave, shifted uncertainly and asked, "But sir, folks say Aurelia Bellfield ain't hurt nobody. She keeps to herself." Ephraim spat in the dirt. "She's a reminder, a thorn, and every thorn left alone grows into a nest of briars." Another man murmured, "But she's just one woman." Ephraim turned sharply, grabbing the man's collar and pulling him close. "One woman who defies the order my daddy died protecting." He released the man with a shove, then looked around, his gaze sweeping the gathering like a blade. "She stands where she does because we've failed to teach her otherwise. That changes soon." Those words cemented the ride to Bellfield Hollow. Not justice, not honor, pride poisoned by resentment. But among the men who followed Ephraim was someone whose presence complicated the night's looming violence. Silas Boone, a reluctant participant. Silas had been raised on a small farm by a mother who died young and a father who tended cattle with a slow, thoughtful manner. The boy had learned to mend fences, read scripture, and fear God without trembling under him. Silas had no interest in the clan. He joined only because his older cousins insisted it was the manly thing to do, a necessary step toward belonging. He was 19. With soft brown hair and hands calloused from farm work. His eyes were wide and earnest, often betraying what he dared not speak, and though he stood among the robed men, his heart was never in their cause. His fear of being ostracized outweighed his sense of justice, but only barely. It trembled within him like a bird trapped under his ribs. A week before the ride, Silas had encountered Aurelia in town. She was purchasing dried beans and a length of coarse fabric. The store was quiet, and Silas, standing beside a barrel of oats, found himself studying her hands. Nimble, deliberate, scarred in faint silver lines that told stories that only she could translate. Their eyes met for a moment. Silas froze. Aurelia didn't smile, but she offered a slight nod. "Evening," she said gently. Silas swallowed. Evening, ma'am." "You look troubled," she said, not unkindly. "A young man shouldn't carry such weight in his face." "I'm fine," he lied, voice cracking. Aurelia paid for her goods and paused at the door, speaking softly enough that only he could hear. "You're not meant for shadows, boy. Be careful which ones you walk into." Her words followed him home. He didn't understand why they unsettled him more than any threat Ephraim ever uttered. Perhaps because she spoke not with judgment, but with certainty. The last character woven into the night's tapestry was Sheriff Abner Cotter, a man who stood on the precarious border between law and survival. Cotter was in his late 40s, tall, with a slightly stooped back from years of riding uneven roads. His hair was thinning and his uniform always bore the faint dust of the countryside. He was not a righteous man, nor a wicked one. He was a man who desperately wished trouble would pass him by without forcing him to choose sides. Cotter respected Aurelia, though quietly. He admired the way she carried herself, the way she asked for nothing, the way she maintained dignity without asking permission. But he feared the wrath of men like Ephraim. The clan had grown bold enough that any sheriff who crossed them risked more than his badge. 2 days before the ride, Cotter had encountered Aurelia near the edge of the hollow. She was gathering firewood, stacking it evenly in her arms. He approached her cautiously, tugging at the brim of his hat. "Miss Bellfield," he said, voice rough with unease. "Evening to you." She turned her head slightly. "Sheriff." He glanced around the dense trees, as though expecting eyes to emerge from behind the trunks. "I heard some talk, unpleasant talk. You might want to keep an eye open these next nights." Aurelia studied him for a long moment. "Thank you for the warning." Cotter hesitated, then said quietly, "They're restless. Times are unpredictable." Aurelia placed another log atop her stack. "Sheriff, times have always been unpredictable. Men simply choose when to show their teeth." He exhaled, defeated. "You got anyone nearby? Anyone who can help if things turn?" Aurelia looked at him evenly. "I have what I need." Cotter nodded, though he did not understand. As he mounted his horse, she called after him, "Sheriff?" He paused. "Not all battles are fought with guns." Her words echoed through the woods long after he rode away. Cotter didn't understand them then. Later, standing before the remains of her cottage, he would understand all too well. And so the stage was set. Aurelia Bellfield, alone but far from helpless. Ephraim Dulles, a tyrant clinging to a dead era. Silas Boone, caught between conscience and cowardice. And Sheriff Cotter, a man whose fear of conflict would soon yield consequences no lawman could outrun. As night crept toward Bellfield Hollow, each character carried their burdens into the darkness, unaware that by dawn their fates would be entangled in ways none of them imagined, and none of them could escape. Long before the night the riders descended into Bellfield Hollow, the land had begun whispering warning. They were small things at first, so faint that even the watchful dismissed them. But the woods keep their own records, and anyone who listened closely would have heard the unease growing like a sickness beneath the soil. It began with the animals. Aurelia, who seldom wasted breath on idle conversation, had been heard murmuring at the feed stores about her hound, an old black stray with a scar across its snout, refusing to sleep inside the cottage. For months the creature had curled dutifully beside her hearth, but starting that October, the dog refused to cross the threshold. It paced outside the door at night, low growls vibrating in its throat, staring into the woods as though something unseen stood among the trees. One evening, while Aurelia collected her purchases, The young shopkeeper, Caleb Lorne, ventured a timid question. "Miss Bellfield," he said, adjusting the crooked kerosene lamp on the counter. "Folks say your dog's been howling near every night. You see something out there?" Aurelia tied her sack of cornmeal and looked at him steadily. "Only the same shadows that have always been there." Caleb swallowed. "Shadows don't make a dog lose its mind." Aurelia's gaze softened just slightly. "No, Mr. Lorne, but men do." She left the store without further explanation, leaving Caleb staring through the window as the dusk swallowed her figure whole. Then there were the lantern lights. Hunters traveling the ridge above the hollow claimed they had seen faint, flickering glows drifting through the trees at hours no sane person would be wandering. Sometimes just one, other times several, weaving in and out of the pines as if following a path only they could see. One hunter swore the lights moved too smoothly to be carried by human hands, gliding rather than bobbing, ignoring the wind entirely. When the men brought these stories to the tavern, their laughter was brittle. A grizzled farmer named Thaddeus Pike muttered into his drink, "Ain't no haint down there. It's her. She's got tricks. Mark my words." Another man replied, "Tricks don't float through branches, Thad." A silence followed, thick and uneasy, until someone whispered, "Maybe it ain't tricks. Maybe it's reckoning. God don't forget the war, neither." But the strangest of the early warnings came from the widowed schoolteacher, Mrs. Florence Key. She had walked the road near the hollow one late afternoon, carrying a bundle of primers under her arm. As she passed the boundary where the trees began to thicken, she heard footsteps following her. Soft, slow, deliberate. She turned. No one. She hurried her pace. The steps hurried too. Only when she crossed the old stone bridge did the sound vanish entirely. When Mrs. Key mentioned it to Sheriff Cotter, she laughed nervously, almost apologizing for her own story. "It must have been my own footsteps echoing back at me," she said, "or some child playing tricks." Cotter tried to reassure her. "I'll ride the road tomorrow, likely just a stray hog in the brush." But Mrs. Key leaned closer, and her voice trembled. "No, Sheriff. Whatever it was walked like a person. And it breathed." Cotter forced a smile he didn't feel. "The woods can mimic all sorts of sounds, ma'am." Yet that night, when he bedded his horse in the small stable behind the jailhouse, Cotter paused, listening to the wind snake through the eaves. He found himself wondering, not for the first time, why the hollow always felt as though it were watching him instead of the other way around. Aurelia, however, noticed far more than she spoke. Some evenings she would pause mid-step while fetching water from her well, turning her head as though catching the faint outline of movement deeper in the trees. She began bolting her door earlier in the evening, sliding an iron latch into place with a deliberate hand. She checked the window hinges twice instead of once. The black hound grew more restless, pacing the yard, whining at the edges of the woods. Once Aurelia placed a calming hand on its head and whispered, "I know. I hear it too." She did not explain what it was. One fog-heavy morning, while preparing her garden beds for the winter frost, she found something pressed into the dirt, a strip of linen torn from a white hood, stiff with dried sweat. She held it between two fingers, studying it without emotion, then folded it precisely and tucked it into her apron pocket. Later, she would burn it in the stove, watching the fibers curl and blacken without a word. But the most unsettling omen came 3 nights before the riders gathered. Silas Boone, still uncertain and ashamed of his involvement with Ephraim's plans, had ridden past the hollow at dusk. The trail was dim, the trees standing like dark pillars against the fading sky. His horse, Pearl, slowed without prompting, ears twitching back and forth. Silas whispered, "Easy, girl. Ain't nothing here." But Pearl refused to move. Her muscles trembled beneath the saddle. Then Silas heard it. A soft tapping, rhythmic, like knuckles drumming gently against wood. Tap, 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 steady as a heartbeat. He froze, listening. The sound echoed faintly through the trees, too distant to be near, too close to ignore. "Hello?" he called, voice cracking. The tapping stopped immediately. Silas felt the air grow colder, as though night had plunged ahead of its time. He gripped the reins and whispered, "We're going, Pearl. We ain't staying." He turned the horse sharply and rode home without looking back. But later, lying awake in his narrow bed, the tapping replayed over and over in his mind. Calm, patient, and impossibly deliberate. These small disturbances might have amounted to nothing on their own. Rural life was full of strange sounds and wandering fears, but in Bellfield Hollow, everything carried weight. The land remembered violence. The trees recalled footsteps that never returned. The soil held secrets like buried bones. And in the days leading up to the night the clan rode in, the hollow grew restless. Its warnings grew clearer. Its shadows lengthened, and every whisper seemed to say the same thing. Something was coming, something long overdue. The decision to ride did not fall from the sky like a storm. It gathered slowly, the way heat collects on a summer afternoon until even the insects grow quiet. It began in Ephraim Dullus's barn, where the loft smelled of moldy hay and old sweat, and the lamplight painted the men's faces in sickly shades of yellow. The white robes were folded in a trunk near the far wall, carefully hidden beneath canvas, as though disguise could make the ugliness beneath them less real. Ephraim stood at the center, thumbs hooked into his suspenders, jaw clenched so hard the cords in his neck stood out. "Last week," he said, voice low, "one of our boys rode up near her hollow. Came back saying he heard something following him, knocking on the trees. You know what that is? That's mockery. That's a woman thinking she can spook good Christian men off land that don't belong to her." Murmurs rippled through the gathered men. Some nodded, eager for a target. Others shifted uneasily, glancing at the floorboards as though they'd rather be anywhere else. A squat man named Roland G. cleared his throat. "Dulles, we got bigger troubles than some old widow in the woods. There's folks talking about new schools for coloreds, saying they might bring in some northern men to run 'em. Maybe our attention ought to be—" Ephraim slammed his fist against the side of the stall, making the horse inside startle and snort. "Every rebel starts somewhere," he snapped. "You let one defiant woman stand and soon enough the rest of them get it in their heads they can stand too. We show the county what happens when the old ways are mocked." His eyes swept the room, catching on Silas Boone lingering near the back, half hidden in shadow. "You with us, Boone?" Ephraim called. Silas swallowed. His stomach twisted, but he knew how quickly word traveled in a place like Marrow Creek. His absence would be noticed. His doubts would be named. And once a man got marked coward, it stuck to him longer than any sin. "Yes, sir," Silas managed. "I'll ride." Ephraim smiled, satisfied, though there was no warmth in it. "Good. We ride Sunday night. When she sees 40 lights coming through those trees, she'll remember who owns this county." The men dispersed in 2s and 3s, slipping from the barn like ghosts who hadn't decided yet whether to haunt or flee. Outside, the evening air was thick with the smell of manure and damp earth. Crickets sang, unaware that decisions made in low barns could alter the shape of dawn. Silas walked home alone, the promise of Sunday pressing against his chest like a fist. That same night, across town, Sheriff Abner Cotter sat in his office with a cheap cigar and a ledger that wouldn't balance. His pen scratched in halting fits, pausing each time a distant noise drifted in through the open window. Laughter from the tavern, a cart rattling over the loose boards of the main street, the distant wail of a train far beyond the river. He was trying very hard not to think about the rumors. He'd heard them in the barber shop, in the churchyard, whispered in the narrow aisle between flour sacks at the general store. "They say Ephraim's planning something out near Bellfield Hollow. Man like that don't just talk, Sheriff. He acts. Someone ought to warn her. Someone with a badge." Cotter had ridden near the hollow once after those whispers reached him. He had seen Aurelia's small figure bent over her garden, heard the metallic ring of her hoe striking stone. He'd nearly dismounted then, nearly walked up to her door and said the thing that kept gnawing at him. "They're coming. Leave." But he pictured Ephraim's sneer, the way those cold eyes measured weakness, and his courage withered. So instead, he had offered vague warnings and ridden home, telling himself there were lines even a sheriff could not cross and expect to keep his life. As Sunday approached, the air grew heavy. In church, Reverend Granger delivered a sermon about judgment. His voice boomed against the wooden rafters as he read from the Book of Nahum, about cities of blood and lying tongues. The congregation sat stiffly, the men glancing sideways at one another, the women staring fixedly at their folded hands. "God sees what men hide," the Reverend intoned. "Nothing done in darkness escapes his notice." Ephraim Dulles sat in the third pew, his expression composed, his Bible open but unread. When Granger's eyes brushed over him, the Reverend's voice faltered for half a breath before regaining its rhythm. Even from the pulpit, some men dared not look certain truths in the face. After the service, as people lingered in the yard to chatter and trade gossip, Mrs. Florence Key approached Cotter. "Sheriff," she said, her gloved hands twisting together, Are you aware of plans being made? The town feels troubled." Cotter forced a weary smile. "We live in troubled times, Mrs. Key. Men talk more than they act." "But some men," she said quietly, eyes flicking toward Ephraim, "act more than they should." Cotter's jaw tightened. He did not answer. That evening, as the last light bled from the sky, Aurelia finished her modest supper and washed her tin plate in a basin of cool water. The hound dozed by the threshold, one eye half open. The cottage smelled of wood smoke and sage, of beans and old iron. On the table lay a folded scrap of linen, fresh this time, white as bone. She unfolded it, fingers steady. This piece had been tucked beneath a rock near her path that morning, anchored by a small stone, as though whoever left it wanted to be sure the wind did not claim it. The fabric bore no name, no mark, only the faint, unmistakable outline of a hood, cut from the same pattern all men in the Brotherhood shared. Aurelia studied it, then set it beside the iron strap she kept close at hand. Names of dead men glinted faintly in the lamplight, scratched into metal by a patient, practiced hand. She reached for a piece of charcoal and noted the date in small, neat script on the back of the linen. November 6th, 1892. She did not write a name. Names came after. Outside, the woods inhaled the last warmth of the day and exhaled a chill that slipped in through the cracks of the walls. Aurelia rose, shuttered the windows, and slid the iron bar across her door. Her movements followed a ritual older than the clan, older than the war, a series of tasks designed not from superstition, but from experience. Locks checked, lantern refilled, tools laid in familiar places, powder dry. She knelt beside her bed, not in pious arrangement but in purposeful motion, lifting the loose floorboard with a quiet creak. From beneath, she drew out a worn canvas roll, untying the faded cord with careful fingers. Within lay the remnants of an earlier life, a Colt revolver with its metal dull from use, a hunting knife honed to a thin, merciless edge, a small brass compass, a folded map whose creases had nearly worn through like veins beneath thin skin. She checked each piece with the calm attention of a seamstress examining thread. No tremor in her hands, no haste. She had done this before, many times, beneath skies lit by different stars, but the same ugly, human intentions. By the time the riders gathered at Ephraim's barn, the hollow was ready. They dressed in silence, white robes rustling softly like shrouds. The hoods would come later, pulled up only when they neared their target. Torches were prepared, soaked rags wrapped around sticks, kerosene sloshing in a small barrel. The horses stamped impatiently, hooves clipping against the packed dirt. Silas Boone's fingers fumbled as he tied his robe. Ephraim noticed. "Cold, boy?" he asked, voice carrying across the yard. Silas swallowed. "Little, sir." "Nothing warms a man like purpose," Ephraim said. "You remember that when we ride down on that witch? You're part of history tonight. This is the kind of act men'll talk about for years." Silas didn't trust his voice, so he merely nodded. As they set off, the sound of hooves rolled through the dark like distant thunder. Torches flared, casting long, leaping shadows across the road. The men rode 2 by 2, a grotesque procession weaving toward the waiting bowl of Bellfield Hollow. At the edge of town, Sheriff Cotter stood on the porch of his office, pipe gone cold in his hand. He watched the line of riders slip past at a distance, just far enough that he could pretend not to recognize faces or count numbers. His deputy, a nervous man named Joel Finn, hovered at his shoulder. "You gonna stop 'em, Sheriff?" Cotter's jaw worked. "From doing what?" "Whatever they're fixin' to do." Cotter hesitated, then shook his head. "You ride in front of 40 men and tell them to go home, Joel. See how many bullets you catch before you finish your sentence. We got the law on our side?" Cotter gave a short, humorless laugh. "Law don't weigh much against men who think they're doing God's work." The riders faded into the dark. Cotter exhaled slowly, a man turning his back on a burning building because he'd convinced himself he had no bucket big enough to fight it. Deep in the hollow, Aurelia doused her lamp. The cottage fell into darkness, but her eyes moved easily in it. Years of nighttime travel had taught her how to live without the comfort of constant light. She stood near the window, listening. At first, there was only the ordinary chorus of the woods, crickets, the soft hoot of an owl, the distant bark of a fox. Then, faint at first, she heard them. Hooves, many of them. The sound filtered through the trees, muffled but insistent, drawing nearer with each passing moment. The dog's hackles rose. It let out a low growl, then another, pacing in a tight circle near the door. Aurelia placed a calming hand on its back. "Hush now," she whispered. "We don't want them thinking we're afraid." The dog whined, then settled grudgingly near the far wall. The first torchlight appeared between the trees like small, floating suns, dipping and rising with the riders' movement. Aurelia watched without blinking as they drew closer, counting the glows under her breath. 10, 15, 20. They entered the basin, the torch's harsh light shattering the hollow's usual dimness. The men fanned out, surrounding the cottage in a wide circle. The horses pawed nervously at the earth, their breath steaming in clouds. Ephraim rode forward, stopping a short distance from the front door. He raised his hand, and the men halted. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of flames and the restless shifting of hooves. "Miss Bellfield," Ephraim called, voice booming. "You come on out now, nice and easy." Silas's heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his throat. He scanned the cottage windows, expecting to see a flicker of movement, a shadow, anything, but the house remained still, a dark, low shape huddled against the slope of the hollow. No answer. Ephraim waited, then laughed, the sound dry and sharp. "You think we don't know you're in there? We rode a long way to pay our respects. It's rude not to greet your guests." Silas leaned toward the man beside him and whispered, "Feels wrong, don't it? There should be light, smoke from the chimney at least." the man grunted. She's hiding. They always hide. Ephraim gestured to Roland G. Bring the cross. Two men dragged a wooden cross from the back of a wagon, its crude shape heavier than it looked. They hauled it to a small clearing just in front of the cottage and jammed it into the ground. Kerosene soaked the wood, dripping onto the roots below. Silas watched, throat tight. Ephraim turned back to the door. Last chance, Miss Bellfield. You come out now. We might be persuaded to keep the lesson gentle. From inside the cottage came a sound, not weeping, not pleading. A low, quiet scraping, like a chair being moved, followed by the soft metallic click of something precise and unforgiving. Aurelia's voice floated out, muffled by the walls but unmistakably calm. 40 horses, she said. Heavy men, light on their souls. Some of the riders shifted uncomfortably. Ephraim sneered. You count well for a woman who ain't seen the light of a proper church in years. Aurelia's response came without haste. I've seen plenty of churches. Saw one in Georgia once, with a Bible so big it took 2 men to carry it. Didn't stop them from hanging a boy out back after service. Silas swallowed hard. To his left, another man muttered, She's talking like she ain't afraid at all. Ephraim jerked his chin toward the cross. Light it. The torch touched the kerosene-soaked wood. Flames shot up in a hungry roar, casting a fierce glow that turned the cottage's rough boards gold and black by turns. Shadows leapt wildly, stretching and distorting the figures of the men gathered around. The cross burned higher. Inside, Aurelia closed her eyes for a moment, the flicker of orange seeping through the cracks around the window shutters. She could smell the acrid tang of the kerosene, hear the fire's greedy hiss. She thought of another fire years ago, when Confederate uniforms had glowed ember red as men screamed in the dark. She thought of the first man whose name she had etched into the iron strap, his blood drying on her hands as cannon fire thundered in the distance. That was a younger woman's work, she said under her breath, but the hands still remember. Outside, Ephraim raised his pistol and fired once into the air. The sound cracked across the hollow like a whip. Enough talk, he shouted. Boys, we're taking her out by force. Horses surged forward, men dismounted, torches in hand, moving toward the door in a tightening ring. The black hound looked up at Aurelia. Stay, she said firmly. The dog obeyed, though its body buzzed with tension. She took her place beside the door, revolver in hand, breath slow and even. Her heart did not race. It beat with steady, measured force. 40, she murmured again. You should have brought more. Later, the survivors would struggle to explain what happened next, if survivors could even be said to exist in such a story. Some would speak of tricks and traps, of a house prepared like a battlefield. Others would whisper of something else moving in the hollow that night, something not entirely bound by walls and bullets. What do you think, guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. By the time dawn crept across Marrow Creek, 40 horses would be found without riders, wandering the tree line in a daze. The cross would be a blackened skeleton, still smoking, and the door, singed but standing, would bear new marks in its stubborn wood. But that is the shape of the morning. The night itself still has much to tell. The night split open the moment Ephraim's men reached Aurelia Bellfield's door. Every rider felt it, though none of them had the courage to name the sensation twisting inside their ribs, the certainty that something had begun, which could not be undone. The first man to reach the front steps was Roland G. He stomped up the short path, torch held high, robe flaring behind him like a ghastly sail. The fire cast him in fierce shades of orange and red, distorting his movements into something clumsy and violent. Get that door down, Ephraim barked. Roland swung his boot at the wood. The sound that followed was not what anyone expected. Instead of splintering or groaning, the door rang, clean, cold, metallic, as if Roland had kicked a slab of iron. He recoiled with a shout, hopping back on one foot, torch wobbling dangerously. "What in—" Ephraim scowled. "Hit it again." "I ain't kicking no enchantment," Roland snapped. "It ain't enchanted," another man muttered, though his voice held no conviction. "Old wood does strange things." Roland, shamed by the eyes watching him, braced himself and swung again. A deeper sound answered him, a low, resonant hum. The vibration of wood struck against something hidden behind it, a sound that seemed to shiver the very air. Several of the horses jerked back, their nostrils flaring, eyes rolling white. Silas Boone felt the hairs on his neck lift. He glanced toward the tree line, certain he saw movement between the trunks, small shapes flitting through the dark like pale moths. But when he blinked, the shadows stilled. "Ain't right," he whispered. "Ain't right at all." Ephraim raised his pistol. "Step aside." He marched up to the porch, jaw locked, fury pulsing through every stride. He pressed the barrel to the lock and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the hollow. Smoke curled. Metal clinked on wood. The door did not move. The lock remained intact. And the bullet, flattened, misshapen, dropped harmlessly onto the porch boards. Silence pooled around the cottage, thick and disbelieving. What kind of sorcery?" someone stammered. Ephraim wheeled around, eyes blazing. "It's reinforced, you half-wits! She's rigged the damn thing!" But even he sounded unconvinced. From inside the cottage came a soft, steady scraping. Aurelia dragging something across the floor. A chair, a table, or something else entirely. Ephraim stepped forward again, pistol raised, when the door suddenly trembled under a heavy impact. But from the inside. One solid strike, then another, as if something large had leaned its full weight against it. "Back!" Ephraim barked instinctively. The men stumbled away from the steps. A third blow sounded, loud enough to rattle the porch beams. Silas felt his throat tighten. "She's trying to get out?" "No," murmured an older rider, voice cracking. "She's keeping something in." Before anyone could respond, the last lantern inside Aurelia's home flickered, its faint glow shining briefly through a crack in the shutter. Then it went out. Darkness devoured the cottage. For a moment, everything was still. Then Aurelia's voice drifted through the walls, calm, controlled, terrifying in its certainty. "You brought your own graves down this hill." Ephraim snarled. "Enough of this nonsense. Break the windows." Two men rushed to comply, running to the side of the cabin with their torches raised high. Silas watched them go, dread churning in his stomach like cold water. "Wait, don't!" he tried to call out. His warning came too late. The first man smashed the butt of his torch against the window pane. The glass shattered. A gust of cold air blasted outward. So sudden and sharp, it extinguished both torches instantly. Flames snuffed with a hiss. Darkness slammed down. The men gasped, stumbling backward. From inside the cottage came the faintest sound, like something inhaling for the first time in years. A long, slow breath. "God save us," one of the torchbearers whispered. He turned to run, and disappeared. Not stumbled, not fell. Vanished, silently, as if plucked from the air. His companions shrieked and bolted, sprinting through the brush, robes tearing on branches. Ephraim shouted after him, "Get back here, coward!" But the fleeing rider never slowed. His white robe flashed between the trees, bobbing like a panicked ghost, then stopped. Suspended, His body hung in the air for a heartbeat, then dropped straight down, swallowed by the dark ground as though the earth opened its mouth. The forest went silent. No rustling, no wind, not even crickets. Silas whispered hoarsely, "What did we walk into?" Ephraim's face twisted with rage. "It's traps! She dug pits! Rigged the ground to—" But even as he spoke, the soil where the man disappeared lay flat and undisturbed. No hole, no depression, no sign anyone had ever walked there. The horses shrieked and tried to flee. Half of them dragged their reins and broke from their handlers, crashing toward the slope, panicked enough to break legs on rocks. Men cursed, scrambling to regain control. "Hold them!" Ephraim shouted. "Hold!" A cry sliced through the air. One of the riders near the rear of the group, a heavy-set man named Carter Long, jerked violently, as though yanked backward by an invisible rope. His hood twisted, his feet lifted off the ground. "Help! Help me!" His hands clawed at the empty air. Men rushed toward him, but before they reached him, Carter's body flew sideways, slammed into a tree with a sickening thud, and dropped limp to the ground. Silas gagged. The man's neck was bent at an impossible angle. Roland stumbled backward, crossing himself frantically. "We gotta go," he gasped. "We gotta go now." Ephraim whirled on him. "Any man who flees dies by my hand before dawn. You hear me?" But no one was listening anymore. They were listening to something else. Breathing. Slow, heavy, deep. But not human. It circled the perimeter of the clearing, closing in on them, without ever stepping into the torchlight. And it came from more than one direction. "How many are there?" someone whispered. Aurelia's voice answered, drifting from inside the cottage as though the walls carried her words outward like a sermon. "Not men." Ephraim snapped. "Show yourself." "I have," Aurelia replied. The door creaked just slightly, as something behind it pressed forward again. The wood moaned. Silas felt something ancient and cold curl around his spine. "You think this is her doing?" one rider whispered frantically. "You think one woman could—" But his question died in his throat. The forest began to glow. Not with fire, with eyes. Dozens of faint, pale lights flickered between the trees, hovering at different heights, some low to the ground, some high as a man's head, some far above where any creature should be able to stand. They blinked in perfect unison. Every torch sputtered, as though the flames themselves wanted to flee. Ephraim raised his pistol and fired wildly into the tree line. The shot echoed uselessly. Silas tried to steady his breathing, but his body trembled uncontrollably. "Ephraim," he whispered, "we gotta go. This ain't a raid anymore. This is something else." For the first time that night, Ephraim hesitated. Not because of fear, he would never admit that, but because something deep inside him, buried under years of rage and pride, recognized danger older than any man alive. Then the door finally opened. Not fully, not even halfway, just a crack. A sliver of darkness deeper than the night around them. And through that gap, Aurelia Bellfield stepped forward. She looked small, almost fragile, bare feet on the porch, gray hair pulled back, no weapon in sight. The riders froze, expecting some monstrous revelation, some horror to emerge behind her. But she was simply Aurelia, except for her eyes. In the torchlight they gleamed not with fear nor anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who had seen death so many times she no longer bothered to flinch at its approach. She surveyed the 40 men, though their number had already shrunk. Then she spoke. "You came here to teach a lesson." A pause. then learn. Ephraim raised his pistol again. Aurelia shook her head. One bullet won't save you. You witch! Ephraim fired. The shot hit her squarely in the chest. Aurelia staggered, but did not fall. The men gasped. Silas felt his heart seize. No blood. No wound. Aurelia inhaled slowly, as if steadying herself after a long walk. War teaches us strange things, she murmured. How to move, how to survive, how to make death wait its turn. Behind her, inside the cottage, something shifted. A shape. Huge. Like a man, but wrong. Then another. Then another. Ephraim's breath hitched. What are you? He choked out. Aurelia's voice was almost gentle. A woman who learned to bury monsters by becoming one. Torches erupted as wind howled through the clearing. The eyes in the forest surged closer. And the night exploded into chaos. If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. Silas Boone never knew exactly when the shouting broke apart into something worse, something too tangled and frantic to bear a name. He remembered Ephraim screaming commands that no one followed, remembered the hiss of torches dying, remembered the flare of the burning cross painting everything in violent orange. Then the wind came. It roared down into the hollow like a living thing, knocking men sideways, tearing hoods from faces. Torches spun from hands and went out mid-air, snuffed as if pinched between invisible fingers. Horses reared, hooves lashing at nothing, whinnies slicing through the dark. Silas clung to Pearl's reins with both hands. "Easy, easy, easy," he cried, voice ragged. Someone slammed into him from behind. Another rider careened past, robe tangling around his legs, sending him crashing hard into the mud. A man shrieked. Another choked mid-curse, his voice cut off in a wet gurgle. Silas saw Ephraim firing wildly at the cottage, muzzle flashes brief and furious. Aurelia stood on her porch, unmoving, small amid the chaos, her gray dress whipping in the wind like a tattered banner. She watched them scatter as if she had seen this all before. Then something moved behind her. Not clearly, just a sense, a deeper darkness shifting in the doorway, taller than any man, its outline wrung in ways the eye refused to focus on. For one heartbeat, Silas thought he saw shoulders broader than a doorframe and arms that didn't end where they should. He blinked. The doorway was empty. Aurelia stepped backward into the house, and the door closed. The instant the latch fell, the air exploded. Silas later described it as a silent thunder, a shock that blasted through his bones without a sound, sending a wave of pressure that knocked him flat. The ground rolled under him like the deck of a ship. He heard men screaming, horses crashing into trees, the sudden crack of wood splitting. Light flared behind his eyes, white and blinding. Then, nothing. No sound. No weight. No world. Just black. When he opened his eyes, he was lying face down in wet leaves at the edge of the hollow, his head throbbing, his ears ringing with a deep, distant hum. The sky above was gray, smeared with the first light of dawn. Pearl stood a few yards away, sides heaving, reins tangled around a sapling. Silas tried to sit up. Pain lanced through his ribs. His legs shook. "Pearl," he croaked. The mare turned her head toward him, eyes rolling white. She snorted, but she did not run. Somehow she had not left him. He clung to her neck and pulled himself to his feet, swaying. The hollow lay before him, a shallow bowl of trees and low ground, thick with mist. Where the burning cross had once stood, a column of smoke still curled, but no flame remained. The smell of char and something sharper, iron, sweat, fear, hung heavy in the air. He saw no men, No bodies. No movement. The cottage sat where it had always stood, its sloping roof blackened but whole. The door was closed. No light seeped through the cracks. No sound drifted from within. "Ephraim?" Silas whispered. Nothing answered but the distant caw of a crow. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, yet something else, a thin thread of terror-stricken duty, pulled him toward the clearing. If the others needed help, if anyone was hurt, he had to know. He took a step forward. The ground beneath his boot gave way, not enough to swallow him, just enough to suck his foot ankle-deep into cold, yielding mud. He yanked his leg free with a curse, heart hammering. The soil looked normal, undisturbed. No pits, no holes, no traps. Just earth. He tried again, picking his way more carefully. Each step left a clean print. No blood, no robes, no fallen guns. 40 men had ridden into that basin. The land bore sign of hooves, of churned soil, of horses' panic, but no sign of human bodies. His chest tightened. "God help us," he whispered. "Where did they go?" From somewhere behind him, a twig snapped. Silas spun, hand flying to the knife at his belt. A figure emerged from the trees. Not hooded, not robed. Sheriff Abner Cotter, eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, rifle slung across his back. "Boone?" Cotter rasped. "That you?" Silas's knees nearly gave out with relief. "Sheriff, thank God." Cotter strode down the slope, boots sliding in loose dirt. "You're alive," he muttered. "At least one of you." He stopped beside Silas, gaze sweeping the clearing. His jaw tightened. "Where's the rest?" Silas's mouth went dry. I don't know. We were here, Sheriff, all of us. Then something like a blast, but no noise. I woke up over there." He gestured vaguely to the trees. "When I came to, it was just me and Pearl." Cotter's eyes lingered on the cottage, then on the burned cross stump, then on the empty spaces where men should have been. 40 rode in, he said softly. 40 horses came back without riders. Finn's been collecting them since dawn. They're running wild along the ridge like they just shook off hell itself. Silas swallowed. "No bodies?" "None, not yet." Cotter stepped deeper into the clearing. The air shifted around him, cool and thick. The sheriff had seen battlefields in his youth, had walked among the dead at Shiloh and Stone's River, but this felt different. Those fields had been loud with flies and groans and the clank of wagon wheels. This place felt as if the world were holding its breath. He reached the porch. Up close, the cottage looked older than its boards, the logs darkened by weather and smoke. The windows were shuttered. The chimney emitted no smoke, yet the stones felt faintly warm when he brushed his fingers against them. Then he saw the door. It bore marks, not splinters from bullets, not dents from boots, neat, precise carvings along the edge nearest the latch. Short, vertical lines grouped in clusters of 5, 4 straight strokes, then a diagonal crossing them. Tally marks, he counted. The numbers rose, each stroke a small, unyielding wound in the grain. He stopped. 200. And beneath the newest cluster, still rough as though cut only hours earlier, lay a fresh group of 40. His blood went cold. Silas saw the color drain from the sheriff's face. "What is it?" he asked hoarsely. Cotter cleared his throat, trying to mask the tremor. "You don't worry about it." But the younger man stepped closer, squinting. Those are counts?" His voice rose. "For what?" Cotter didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a handkerchief, wrapping it around his knuckles before knocking on the door. "Miss Bellfield," he called. "It's Sheriff Cotter. I need you to open up." Silence. He waited, listening for footsteps. No creak of boards, no rustle. "Miss Bellfield," he said again, louder this time. "I know you're in there. I found your lamp still warm. We need to talk about what happened last night." Still nothing. He tried the latch. It did not move. He put his shoulder against the door and shoved. It didn't budge, but the frame groaned faintly, as though resisting out of habit rather than strength. Then, from somewhere deep inside the house, the black hound barked. One hard, sharp sound. A warning. Or a greeting. Cotter dropped his shoulder. "There's someone in there," Silas whispered. "Dog wouldn't bark at an empty house." Cotter stepped back, mind racing. He thought of forcing the door, of dragging Aurelia out in irons, of bringing her before a judge. But what judge? This was clan business. The men who had ridden against her carried names that appeared on church rolls and tax ledgers. Their families were the county's backbone, for better or worse. He also thought of the iron strap he'd glimpsed through a crack near the floor when he'd leaned in, metal glinting with scratched letters. He'd seen enough war tags to know a death roll when it was staring back at him. "Sheriff," Silas pressed. "What do we do?" Cotter inhaled, long and slow, then turned away from the door. "We go back," he said. "We get help. We bring Finn, the doc, Reverend Granger, maybe some of the families. We'll come back proper." Silas stared at him. "We're just leaving her? After what happened?" Cotter's eyes flicked to the door again, to the rows of tally marks. "No," he said quietly. "We're leaving the hollow. Just for now." They rode out together, the path behind them swallowing their tracks as mist rose from the damp ground. By mid-morning, half the town had gathered outside the sheriff's office. Word traveled faster than any horse. Women clutched shawls tight around their shoulders. Men stood with arms crossed, faces stiff, eyes darting. Children tried to sneak near the hitching posts, only to be pulled back sharply by anxious hands. 40 men can't just vanish," someone insisted. "It ain't natural." "Maybe she killed 'em all and dragged the bodies into the ravine," another muttered. "Ain't no ravine deep enough to hide 40 grown men overnight," an older farmer replied. Inside the office, Cotter, his deputy Finn, Dr. Lionel Carrow, and Reverend Granger crowded around a roughly drawn map of the hollow. Silas sat in a corner, pale and shaking, a blanket around his shoulders despite the late morning warmth. Dr. Carrow, a thin man with spectacles and a permanent frown, adjusted the map with bony fingers. "You're certain there were no obvious injuries on the ground, Sheriff? No blood?" "None," Cotter said. "Not so much as a nosebleed. Like they walked off on their own 2 feet and just kept going until the world ran out." Granger's lined face was grave. "The Lord's judgment can fall swift and unseen." Carrow scoffed. "With respect, Reverend, judgment leaves remains, bones, flesh. This leaves us nothing." Finn shifted uneasily. "Maybe she, cut 'em up and buried the pieces." "In one night," Carrow snapped. "With what tools? On soil you say shows no fresh disturbance?" Finn shrank back. Granger cleared his throat. "What about Miss Bellfield herself? You saw no sign of her?" "No sign, but she's in there," Cotter said. "Heard her dog. That house ain't empty." Silas spoke up, voice cracking. "She stood on the porch while it all happened. Ephraim shot her, Sheriff. I seen it. Hit her dead center. She didn't fall." Carrow turned sharply. "Perhaps he missed." "I was 20 feet away," Silas insisted. "I heard the hit, saw her jerk back, but when the smoke cleared she was still standing." Granger's eyes narrowed. "Sometimes the Lord preserves his chosen instruments for his own purposes." "The Lord didn't ride on that woman's porch," Cotter said. 40 Klansmen did." The room fell silent. The word lay between them like a live coal. Clan, brotherhood, protection league. Whatever name men used, it meant the same thing. Violence cloaked in righteousness, cruelty dressed as order. Granger glanced toward the window, where several wives of the missing men waited, faces drawn tight with muted panic. "Sheriff," the Reverend said carefully, "you know the weight of the names involved. Dulles G. Pike. If word spreads that their husbands vanished on a raid against a lone woman, there will be repercussions." "You think I don't know that?" Cotter snapped, then caught himself. He scrubbed a hand over his face. "I'm saying we need to tread careful. Facts first, stories later." Caro folded his arms. "Then we go back. We search the hollow from rim to root. If there's a rational explanation, we'll find it." Granger murmured, "And if there isn't?" No one answered. They rode out again in a grim procession that afternoon. Cotter led, Caro beside him, Finn and Silas behind, followed at a distance by Reverend Granger and 3 of the wives, Ephraim's sister, Roland G's young bride, and Carter Long's mother, clutching a Bible so tightly the leather creaked. Near the gnarled oak marking the hollow's entrance, Cotter held up a hand. "Wives stay here," he said gently. "No sense in you seeing what you don't have to." Ephraim's sister, Margaret Dulles, met his gaze head-on. She was tall, sharp-featured, with the kind of spine that years of managing a difficult household had carved into iron. "That's my brother down there," she said. "If he's hurt, I go. If he's dead, I go. You can't bar me from either, Sheriff." Cotter hesitated, then gave a weary nod. "Stay close, then. Don't wander." They descended. The hollow looked different in daylight. The trees were less ominous, their trunks clearly visible, moss glinting faintly green. Birds called from the canopy. A squirrel chattered briefly before darting higher. The bowl of land lay quiet, ordinary, the cottage squatting at its center like any other poor shack in the county. But even Caro, who scoffed at superstition, felt his stomach knot. "Show me where you woke," he said to Silas. Silas pointed to the tree line. "Over there. Pearl was near that crooked pine." Caro examined the ground, crouching to run his fingers over the soil. Hoof prints, boot prints, but no drag marks, no pooling, no high disturbance zones where a struggle might cluster. Margaret stared at the burned cross stump. "Ephraim lit that, didn't he?" No one answered. Finn swallowed. "Ma'am, we can't say for sure." She rounded on him. "I wasn't born blind, Deputy. I know what my brother does when the sun goes down." Her voice cracked on the last word, but her eyes remained dry. Cotter approached the cottage once more. The door looked as it had that morning. The tallies remained. He forced himself to look at the numbers to see them as evidence rather than curse. 240. That was a body count the county ledger would never record. "Miss Bellfield," he called. "This is Sheriff Cotter again. We got witnesses and a doctor with us. We need to speak to you about last night." Silence. He tried the latch. This time, it moved. The door swung inward with a slow, creaking sigh. Finn gasped. Margaret buried a hand in Ephraim's sister's arm. Caro stepped forward, eyes sharp behind his spectacles. The interior of the cottage was dim. Cotter held up his lantern, its light sweeping across the cramped space. A narrow bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a worn Bible open to Psalms, jars lined up neatly on a shelf, a tiny stove with a pot resting atop it, a quilt folded with military precision at the foot of the bed. No Aurelia. The black hound lay beside the hearth, head on its paws. It lifted its eyes briefly to the intruders, then closed them again, as if too tired to care. Caro frowned. "She's not here?" "Maybe she ran," Finn whispered, "out the back when Silas got knocked out." "There is no back door," Caro said. He was right. The cottage had only one entrance, now standing open to the hollow like a wound. Cotter stepped further in. His boot struck something under the bed. He bent, lifted the edge of the quilt, and peered beneath. "Lord have mercy," he breathed. He reached down and pulled something out, a strip of iron, worn but solid, with a buckle on one end and faint scratches along its length. Caro leaned in. "What is that?" Cotter turned it toward the light. The scratches were letters. Names. Rank abbreviations. Company notations. And beside each, a date. "Confederate officers," Caro murmured. "From the 16th, looks like. I treated some of those men. They disappeared on patrol near the end of the war. We called them lost to the fog." "They weren't lost," Cotter said, voice hoarse. "They were counted." Margaret stepped into the doorway, pale. "Sheriff, what are you saying?" He met her gaze. "I'm saying this woman's been keeping a record. Since the war. Men gone missing. Always in this same patch of county." Finn shivered. "You mean she killed all of them? Alone?" Caro shook his head slowly. One person could do a great deal with time, knowledge of the terrain, and the will to survive. But 200 men, and now 40 more? It strains belief. Granger stood on the threshold, eyes taking in the scene. "So perhaps your belief needs stretching, Doctor. Evil doesn't always obey arithmetic." Margaret's face twisted. "Are you saying Aurelia Bellfield is some kind of demon? That my brother was taken by witchcraft?" "I'm saying your brother rode with intent to terrorize an unarmed woman," Granger replied quietly. "Whatever met him there afterward, that's between him and God." She moved toward him so fast Finn flinched. "Don't you dare preach over my brother's bones when you can't even find them." Cotter stepped between them. "Enough. This ain't helping nobody." Caro cleared his throat. "Sheriff, with your permission, I'd like to examine this cabin more thoroughly. Collect any fibers, residues, anything that might suggest what happened. And I'll need to speak with Mr. Boone alone. His account is all we have of the event itself." Cotter nodded. "Do it. And Reverend, I'd appreciate you talking to the families. Calm them best you can. We'll need this kept quiet till we know what we're facing." Granger hesitated. Truth has a way of leaking through the smallest cracks. "Then we brace for it," Cotter said. "But not today. Today, we search." They combed the hollow until dusk, pulling back brush, probing the soil, scanning the trees for any sign of bodies caught in branches or ravines. They found only hoof marks, boot prints, a few scattered pieces of cloth torn on brambles. No blood, no bones, no weapons, as though the men had stepped off the face of the earth. By the time they trudged back to town, the sky had turned the color of old bruises. That night, the first rumors began. Some said Aurelia Bellfield had struck a deal with dark forces during the war, trading her soul for vengeance. Others claimed she had a hidden band of Union loyalists still living in the woods, waiting decades for the chance to finish what the war had started. A quieter few, mostly older black residents who had watched white men ride in robes for too many years, simply shook their heads and murmured that the Lord's patience had finally worn thin. The Marrow Creek Gazette printed a cautious column 2 days later, written by a young reporter named Edwin Hale, who smelled a story bigger than anything his sleepy town had ever offered. 40 local men missing after unexplained incident in Bellfield Hollow, the headline read. Authorities investigate possible tragedy. The article mentioned unusual disturbances, a long-standing recluse, and the lingering ghosts of the late war. It did not mention the clan by name. It did not mention the tallies carved into Aurelia's door. It did not mention the iron strap of Confederate dead. Those details remained tucked in Cotter's growing file. A file he already suspected he might take to his grave. But files cannot contain fear. In the weeks that followed, Marrow Creek became a town of glances and whispers. Women clutched children tighter when they passed the road to the hollow. Men who had once bragged openly of their night rides grew quiet, eyes darting to the tree line as though expecting judgment to come pacing out at any moment. Silas Boone woke most nights sweating, half certain he could still hear that silent thunder rolling through his skull. He began avoiding barns, avoiding horses, avoiding the mirror. He saw Aurelia's eyes whenever he closed his own. Not angry, not wild, just unbearably tired. And Sheriff Cotter, sitting alone in his office with the iron strap on his desk and a map of the county pinned to the wall, began to trace the pattern of the disappearances. Small patrols gone missing during the war. Lone riders found dead without clear cause in the years after. Now, an entire column of hooded men swallowed in one night. Patterns, he thought. Always the same hills. Always the same hollow. At some point, this stopped being coincidence. It became something else. What that something else was, he did not yet dare to name. The morning after the town's uneasy search party returned from Bellfield Hollow, Sheriff Abner Cotter found himself staring at the same iron strap he had placed on his desk the night before. The names seemed to move when he wasn't looking, like water shifting under moonlight. He had read them one by one until his vision blurred, until the candle burned down to a nub, until his own reflection in the window glass startled him. He had fallen asleep at the desk, shoulders aching, cheek pressed against the cold wood. The strap rested an inch from his fingertips. At dawn, he bolted upright. The strap had moved. It now lay perfectly aligned with the edge of his desk, as if placed by a careful hand. Abner stared at it, pulse quickening. He lived alone. He had locked the door of the office before collapsing. No one knew the strap was here except the men who rode with him yesterday, and none of them had keys. The sheriff swallowed hard, wiped sweat from his temple, and slid the iron into a drawer he locked with his privacy key. He told himself he needed sleep, that exhaustion made fools of the senses. He told himself the strap couldn't have moved. But the hollow feeling in his gut said otherwise. By midday, Cotter had received 3 visitors. Margaret Dulles demanding updates with a stiffness that masked terror. Mrs. G sobbing into a handkerchief she had nearly torn apart at the seams, and Reverend Granger, who entered the office with a Bible tucked under one arm and the weariness of a man whose prayers had grown heavier by the hour. "I don't come with answers," Granger said quietly as he sank into the chair across from Cotter. "But I come with questions that won't leave me be." Cotter rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Get in line." Granger leaned forward. "Tell me again, slowly, what Silas Boone claims he saw." Cotter resisted the urge to glance at the locked drawer. "He says they gathered round the house. Bellfield came out. Ephraim fired. She didn't fall. Men vanished. Something moved behind her." "And you believe him?" "I believe the boy thinks he's telling the truth." Granger sighed. "Then we're left with 2 choices. Madness or the miraculous." Cotter frowned. "Miraculous ain't the word I'd use for this." "Miracles come in many forms, Sheriff," Granger murmured. "Some soothe,